Namaste and welcome to this edition of Book Talk with Mr. Prasenjit Basu. Thank you so much for joining us, PK. It's really a delight to talk to you on your new book, India Reborn. If you have it with you, you can show it to our viewers.
I need to pull it out from here. Here it is.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Great. Congratulations. So this book is a great read. It's been published by Blue and Ink. And if you can also pull out your earlier book, Asia Reborn, if you don't mind. Yes. Wow. Now, just look at this book. It's more than
This one's a
750
bit
pages
thicker.
long.
Yeah.
It's massive.
Yes.
So, viewers, we're going to talk about these two books. They are interrelated, and together they constitute, in my view at least, a major revisionist project of history. I want to sometimes call it writing macro histories rather than micro histories. Today is a world in which we talk about not only microaggressions and all this identity politics and wokeism and so forth, but also these really tiny micro histories, histories of specific tribes or little areas. I'm not trying to diminish their importance because they all add up, but how about the broad picture? And all of us are really uh, sort of dying to get a glimpse of the broad picture, and I think, PK, you do it better than anybody else. So let's just start with a very quick summary of these two books. Maybe you can start with India Reborn, since it's the new book. Like, what's your major point and project? What are you trying to accomplish in India Reborn?
What I'm trying to accomplish is a few things. First of all, demonstrating why it is that Indian civilization or Bharatiya civilization survived while almost all the other ancient civilizations that were contemporaries of Bharatiya civilization did not. So the Persian civilization, the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, the Egyptian, the Inca, the Aztec, they all have fallen by the wayside. Champa to our east, Champa existed from 192 CE until 1462. So all of these great civilizations of the past have ceased to exist. And in effect, they were destroyed by the Abrahamic civilizations. They were destroyed by Christianity in the case of Greece and Rome, and Islam in the case of the Zoroastrian or Persian civilization. And actually, even further, if you look at people, the Berber civilizations of North Africa, etc., they all ceased to exist. Egypt actually ceased to exist long ago. We think of Cleopatra as Egyptian, but in fact, she was Macedonian. And already by then, it was part of the Greco-Macedonian world, which itself then succumbed to the Christian attack on what they called pagan religions and civilizations. So we survived. And now, what was interesting is that the way Indian history has been written, it is a history of defeat. I talked to many of my friends, even someone who reviewed my book for Sunday Guardian. He was very convinced about most of my arguments, but one of the things he sort of said is that, there's no getting away from the fact that we were defeated all the time. You see, we were defeated. All civilizations, great civilizations, often face defeat. They face retreat. India's civilization retreated, but never entirely collapsed. That's the difference between us and the Persian or Zoroastrians, just to our west. And the reason for that, is that we fought back. There is a long period between Muhammad bin Qasim and Mahmud of Ghazni. And during that time, the Arabs were pushed back, and they were pushed back to what is now Afghanistan, and sometimes beyond. So the point is that we fought back, we survived. It's interesting that at the time that Babur won the Battle of Panipat, it was the Great War as far as North India was concerned. But there was a much greater civilization, there was a much greater empire in Vijayanagar, where Krishnadeva Raya was ruling. And the Portuguese who visited Krishnadeva Raya in Vijayanagar said that the Vijayanagar capital was the greatest city on earth, the most prosperous, and the socially most welfare-oriented, with a king who was a polymath and an absolutely remarkable person. So, he wrote novels, poetry, he knew 5 languages, and he was an incredible ruler. So we know so little about this aspect of our history. The fact that Vijayanagar was a much greater empire than the Mughals, and they ruled for a longer period over a larger part of India than the Mughals did, and we barely know them. They are almost a footnote. So now, of course, in the end, they too were defeated. Vijayanagar suffered a horrific defeat in 1565. But between 1565 and 1674, there was a fairly brief period of eclipse in peninsular India before Shivaji emerged, and the Maratha Empire then became the dominant empire in peninsular India. So the point I make there with that first thesis of the book is that Indian civilization survived. It went into retreat, but there were always redoubts of the civilization that that Hindus who felt that it was impossible to survive in this dhimified atmosphere could go to those redoubts. They could go to Vijayanagar, they could go to Nepal, they could go to Manipur and Assam and Tripura. So there were always redoubts. So even at the point of greatest retreat, the civilization did not die out, which is the difference with almost all the others. So in a sense, you could argue that the Greco-Romans didn't entirely die out either, in the sense that they were...
Let's just discuss this thesis, if I may just hop in, because I feel what, at least to me, when I was reading the book in manuscript as well, I felt that it was a very interesting combination of the old and the new. Let me just say why I think so. Kuch baat hai ke hasti mitti nahi hamari, tarana-e-Hind of Iqbal. I think that there has been this understanding, if not understanding, at least acknowledgement that there was some strange, mysterious cause for the persistence of Indian, you might even call it Hindu civilization. I mean, Vivekananda talked about it. He said, our civilization is indestructible. Sri Aurobindo talked about it. So there is that idea, which, in fact, in my view, gained a new salience under colonialism, under British colonialism, when we were actually seeing the seeds of this revival. And you talk about that as well. So there is that notion that there was something in us that made us persist. And there is also, by the way, a growing number of these alternative histories to the mainstream line of thinking about us as not just a defeated civilization, but a civilization which has been shaped by repeated invasions, which is really the colonialist paradigm. And I think it starts with James Mill, where he sees India always as a conquered land, and exogenous factors, being far more significant to, what happened in the subcontinent than internal factors. And it's so important to reverse this, that it is actually not just the indigenous pushbacks, but, production, economic activity, distribution, sort of channels of lending, borrowing. I mean, your own family goes back to the earliest lending institutions of India, the earliest banks of India in Khulna and so forth. So you have an internal sort of connection with, what was actually happening in India, which has not been talked about. In fact, even the growth of modern capitalism has an Indian side to it. So for me, what was fascinating was that the old and the new. The old meaning, yes, we persisted. Yes, there was something tremendously, should I say, special. I mean, Indian exceptionalism, if you will, Hindu exceptionalism. which made us survive. And that's a well-known idea. Also, the idea that we need to change this picture. First of all, a North India-centric picture and a picture of invasions, of defeats. We have to change this. But I think what was new in your book, at least to me, was the new evidence, the new ways of presenting this argument. For example, you talk about the pushback against the Arabs. In fact, the Arabs were completely pushed back, and it was the Turkic, better than Turkish, because all these were, Ghazni and Ghori were, very strange creatures combining all kinds of forces. And Ghazni's grandfather was himself a Buddhist. Anyhow, so I think some of this pushback, even Sitaram Goel talked about. But I think that you're bringing to this narrative some new insights, some new ways of accessing the information. And certainly, I think what I appreciated so much in Asia Reborn was this larger picture. You just spoke about Champa. See, in India, until you actually travel to these areas, we have no idea of, it was India who shaped the East right up to Kyoto, and of course, Suniti Kumar Chatterjee documented this going with Tagore on his eastward voyages, but still the understanding has not seeped deep down. Uh, so this is your first thesis. I've already sort of commented a bit on it. So please tell us about your other two theses, if you will.
Yeah. So just to continue with what you were saying, Indic civilization, of course, had a huge impact on the likes of Cambodia, what is now Thailand, all of Indonesia, all the way to Japan. And in fact, in Japan, their tombstones are written in a form of Sanskrit. They call it the Siddham script. Even today, most of them can't read it, but the sacred script of the Japanese is Siddham, and it is a Brahmi that is close to Sanskrit. Now, the old Philippine language was written in a Brahmi script. So the Philippines, I think, is a classic example. In the year 1521, Magellan was killed in the Philippines by a Hindu king of Mactan. And there are no Hindus left at all in the Philippines today, and they have hardly any memory of that. So it's been 500 years. There's no memory of their pre-Christian past. It barely exists, and when they come across elements of it, they're surprised. So we have that extreme, and then in India we have actually entirely survived. And I think the survival of it included the fact that in British times, when the British were ruling India, they only had control of about 2/3 of the land and about 3/4 of India's people. The rest were in independent kingdoms where the civilization continued to thrive. In fact, I'd say that the reason why Kerala has such high literacy rates is because the kings of Travancore and Cochin introduced universal primary education in 1905, as did the king of Baroda. Anyway, so I think we also need to give some credit to the so-called princely states. They were called subsidiary allies by the British, but in fact they were treaty allies. And the treaties were made at various points in time, but in fact they were independent. And you see this to some degree in our capital, New Delhi, where you have Hyderabad House and you have Patiala House. All these are essentially the embassies of the treaty allies right around India Gate. Anyway, so now the next important thesis, is that the revolutionaries played the most crucial role in forcing the British to leave India. Now, so this is now I then look at basically the British period of our history, starting around 1700. Now, 1757 is the traditional point at which British rule begins in the old province of Bengal, which basically was a large part of the eastern part of the subcontinent. Now, it began in 1757, but in fact, the British arrived in Madras, in Chennai, a lot earlier, and in places like Surat. They were traders, but they were trading very, very successfully. They were buying the cloth, the textiles and garments of India, which were abundant in India and therefore very cheap, and they were selling it into Europe, where even basic cotton vests and underwear didn't exist. So when you could take the stuff and sell it there, it was so scarce that the price was very high. And that is why the initial British traders became extremely wealthy. Among them was Elihu Yale. Elihu Yale started Yale University, where my daughter went. But in addition, there were the likes of the Pitt family, Thomas Pitt. Elihu Yale was governor of Madras for 5 years. Thomas Pitt was governor of Madras for 10 years. And Thomas Pitt's grandson was Pitt the Elder, William Pitt, the Prime Minister of Britain in the late 1750s. And his son, William Pitt the Younger, was perhaps the most important prime minister in the early 19th century. So they had they were able to establish a family political dynasty based on the wealth that was amassed in Madras when they were mere traders. They were traders. The president of Madras in the period until about 1710 was Thomas Pitt, and he made so much money there that he established a family political dynasty. And part of that is now, it resulted in Pittsburgh being established in their name, as well as this great family dynasty that became the most prominent in British politics. So it began already by then. Now, the interesting thing is that the British then imposed a ban. Around 1710, they imposed a complete ban on imports of textiles from India into Britain. So the dirty secret of capitalism is that the British Industrial Revolution was made possible by protectionism, by protecting the Lancashire textile industry from imports from India, from banning all imports. And then, as late as 1813, more than 50 years after the Industrial Revolution had begun, they still had to impose an 82% import duty on textiles coming from India. So even with all this mill-made cloth and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that in Western economic histories, the loot from India does not figure as a factor at all. It is not even mentioned as a contributory factor to the Industrial Revolution having started in Britain. My point is that the Industrial Revolution started in Britain rather than Spain, because in Spain and Portugal, they basically conquered regions where they found a lot of gold and silver and precious metals, and other mineral wealth. But the British came to India, where they found the most industrialized society on earth. And Britain industrialized because it then reverse engineered the Indian textile industry and created it in Britain. So we often think of power and steel, steam power and steel playing an important part, but that was a much later development. The original Industrial Revolution was, of course, a textile one, and later, of course, steel. Now, interesting thing is that India was the originator of steel production as well. It was the originator of great shipbuilding. So we had all of this in India, and all of it was slowly moved to Britain through a process of import substitution and protectionism. So those things, I think, need to be more widely known and debated. I think the economic historians of the West entirely ignore the fact that the loot from India played a huge part in financing the Industrial Revolution, and the protection of the domestic market from imports from India played a massive role as well. So,
Yes.
and that'll change economic theory. It'll change the arguments for protectionism versus free trade also.
Yeah, exactly. I
Uh,
mean, nevertheless, again, these ideas and arguments have been prevalent for a while, including India's deindustrialization contributing to the industrialization of Britain and then of the rest of Europe and so forth. Of course, you've quoted Angus Madison's magisterial research. Now, there's a pushback against that from various quarters. The drain of wealth theory, has been as old as Dadabhai Navroji and Rajni Pamedat. And now there's so much evidence, and it's become a part of the popular imagination with Shashi Tharoor and others. There are even estimates of what the drain was. Some people are saying 33 trillion pounds or dollars, which is currently, a little under the debt of the United States, which is sitting at 39 trillion or whatever. So, absolutely, these ideas. See, there are two things. One is that the ideas have not yet been mainstream. That's for sure. But they have been around. But as I said again, to me, it's a combination of the known and the unknown, in the sense the way you arrange these things and the way you make the connections and your broader sweep, which I think we'll talk about in our next episode. But very quickly, tell us the third thesis, and then we'll wind up our first of our 3 episodes in which we talk about your work. So tell us the third
yeah,
important thesis. Yes.
third and fourth. So the third one is that the revolutionaries played the primary role in obtaining every single concession that the British ever made to India. The British never intended to leave India. I think it should be well understood that the British came to conquer and to rule us forever. That was definitely the goal, as they did in the Americas, and as the Spaniards and the Portuguese have done in Latin America. So, they were pushed back from all of the Americas by the settler populations who were their own people. The English, the Anglo-Saxon people of North America, and the Spanish and Portuguese further south. But in India, they failed. And they failed because of the Indian pushback. And so they failed not because of the goodness of their hearts at all. It was because of the revolutionaries all the way. So now, of course, now I have to juxtapose this with your favorite person, Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Mahatma Gandhi had a very important role in mobilizing India's people. But I think even that, the idea that Mahatma Gandhi mobilized India's people for the first time is incorrect to a large extent, because the mass mobilization of Sri Aurobindo and Balpal Lal in 1905 to 1908 was massive as well. It may have been more concentrated in urban India, perhaps, but it was a mass mobilization that shook the foundations of the British Empire. But of course, Gandhiji then took it further, and he mobilized all of India's people, and for that I give him credit. But the British never made a single concession to Gandhi. And this is this is a key thesis of my book, where I look at the 3 main movements that Gandhi led, and I point out that after the first one, which is the non-cooperation movement of 1920-21, Gandhiji came very close to getting something from the British, but he didn't take the bait. The British were offering a roundtable conference on the 14th of January 1922. Gandhi turned it down. He said, I'll only come to that conference if you release Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, and so that fell through. So that was the only time he came close to getting a concession, and the concession would probably have led to something like dominion status had he come to that roundtable conference. So the first movement came quite close, I'd say, but we will never know whether it got anything or not. The second one was the civil disobedience movement, Salt Satyagraha and so on, which resulted in the 1935 Government of India Act, which was a moth-eaten form of self-rule, merely at the provincial level, and even at the provincial level, the governors had ultimate control over everything apart from the less important things. Finance, for instance, was controlled by the governor, and at the central level, everything was more or less controlled by the governor general. So there was by the viceroy. So there really was nothing approaching independence obtained through civil disobedience movement. And finally, of course, then there was the Quit India movement, which was crushed within 6 months. So on the other hand, we have the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries begin with 1857. Now, I have entirely rewritten the 1857-1858 story. Firstly, 1857 was merely the beginning. Most of the First War of Independence was fought in 1858. And it was led by Tatya Tope, Nana Sahib, and of course, there were the Nawab of Farrukhabad, the Maulvi Ahmadullah Khan of Ayodhya, um, and so on. So there were a number of them, but they fought, and they fought for a national cause. So again, I differ with the standard histories would say that this was neither Indian nor national nor a movement. There was nothing, it wasn't, it was just some sort of feudal uprising. Far from it, starting from the Azamgarh Declaration of 25th August 1857, there was a very clear manifesto, and they were fighting for India's cultural, economic, and political freedom. And I argue that India got its cultural freedom on the 1st of November, 1858, when Victoria made a proclamation saying, clause number 1, we will never again interfere in the religions of India. So that is what differentiates us from the Philippines. The British agreed as a result of that war that they would not ever again interfere in the religions of India. So you and I went to an Anglican college. I went to an Anglican school, but we were never converted. There was no attempt to convert us. I would say there were no attempts to convert Indians until as late as 2004, when Sonia Maino became the effective ruler of India, and then the reconversion movement started again. But the point is that the British then, you see, until 1857, there was a significant conversion movement going on, which was one of the sparks for the 1857 war. But in 1858, and I lay out why that was. Tatya Tope had just crossed the Narmada. Had he reached Nagpur, Satara, and Kolhapur, etc., within 3 or 4 days, then there would have been an uprising in the Bombay army, in the Maratha heartlands, and that would have completely transformed the nature of that war. So the British quickly moved with that proclamation, and they announced an amnesty for all those who had fought against them as well. So in a sense, it was almost a declaration of, not a complete surrender, but at least a partial surrender. So a partial surrender happened there. Similarly, in 1905 to 8, the nationalist faction of the Congress was dominant. They turned to violence when they were expelled at the Surat Congress in 1907 December, and then they had a huge impact in 1910 and 11, after Sri Aurobindo had moved to Pondicherry. His number 2, Bhaga Jyotin Mukherjee, and his other acolytes subverted the Jat regiment in Fort William, right next to the headquarters of the Viceroy of India. And the Jat regiment rose in revolt, as a result of which um, they hushed it up. They executed 45 of the main instigators of that, and they quickly rescinded the partition of Bengal. So a massive concession, again, made by the British, but made in a way that seemed as if it was being done out of the goodness of their hearts. But in fact, they were forced to do it by the revolutionaries. Similarly, then you come to the Second World War, the Ghadar movement. It barely is covered in our history books. But in fact, why is it that Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, made a speech in the House of Commons on the 20th of August, 1917, saying, in effect, that after the war, India would be given self-determination, which sounded a lot like dominion status. Instead, what we got is the Rowlatt Act in March 1919. Now, the reason the Rowlatt Act came up is because the revolutionaries had, in fact, shaken the very foundations of the British Empire during the First World War. And that is something that, it's simply, if you look at the logical reason, how is it? Why would they do such an illogical thing as come up with the Rowlatt Act, which gave them dictatorial powers, instead of moving towards dominion status? Because they had been shaken to their foundations by the Ghadar movement, which we really need to examine much more closely. Similarly, in the Second World War, you have the Quit India movement occurring from 8th of August 1942. Within 5 or 6 months, it is entirely crushed. The Stamralipti and all of these movements happened around October 1942. By January 1943, it was all crushed. And the interesting thing is, during that 5-month period when the Quit India movement was at its most effective and potent, even then, about 100,000 Indians, on average, were joining the British Indian Army every single month. So a total of 500,000 people, about 500,000 people, joined the British Indian Armed Forces during the height of the Quit India movement. So our leader, our non-violent leader, is telling the British to quit India, and yet our people are joining their army to fight in it to preserve the empire. I think that is the ultimate negation of the leadership of our non-violent leader.
Exactly. But that is also
and
in
then,
its own ways.
to end that,
yeah.
And then, of
a
course,
success
you
of the
have
British Empire. It also is a success of the British Empire that they could recruit all these Indians to fight for them and maintain their empire and its outposts, even in Hong Kong. See, when I went to China for the first time as a part of a Indo-Chinese, cultural delegation, they said, look, name one major moment in our history when we fought for the foreigners. You Indians, they told me, you're always divided. You always fought against each other. Anyhow, we'll come back to that. But
okay,
let's
very interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
On that point, in Hong Kong, it is the Indians who are fighting. It is the Punjab regiment that fought. The British officers ran away. The Punjab regiment, the Indian Punjabis, fought to the last man at the barricades in Hong Kong. But the point is that along came Raj Bihari Bose, the leader of the Ghadar movement in the First World War, and Subhash Chandra Bose, and they then created an Indian National Army that demonstrated, firstly, that it was entirely independent. It was entirely independently funded by Indian donations. It had its own Azad Hind Bank. It had a currency that held its own because it was gold-backed right through the war, whereas the Japanese currency in that region lost value very rapidly. The Azad Hind currency did not. Now, the other aspect is that they then fought all of this was censored in India. But when the INA trials happened, the INA trials opened the eyes of Indians to what had happened in the war and the fact that a freedom army of Indians had fought, had won battles, lost battles, had an army of its, had a government of its own. This completely transformed the attitudes of all of India's soldiers and policemen. I quote from Maulana Azad, who opposed Bose. But he says that he was president of Congress. Wherever he went across India, soldiers and policemen would come up to him and said, "It's now time. We are with you. Go and get independence." So, and then, of course, you had the mutiny of the Air Force. You had the mutiny of the Royal Indian Navy. 77 of the 88 ships of the Royal Indian Navy mutinied in the name of Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA. They were called they rebadged HMIS Talwar was rebadged as INNS, Indian National Naval Ship. 78 of the 88 ships of His Majesty's Indian ships were rebadged Indian National Naval Ships. And that was the end of the empire. If the British couldn't have naval control of India, they couldn't control India. And so 18th of February 1946 is when every shore and port establishment of the Navy had revolted. The following day, Attlee announced that he would be sending his three senior-most colleagues to negotiate India's independence. That's the first time any British Prime Minister had ever used the word independence. People say that the Labour Party manifesto of 1945 basically was granting India independence. Utter nonsense. The exact, you should just look at the Labour Party manifesto. Why don't people look at it? The entire manifesto has one long sentence out of about 20
And it's
pages. One
gobbledygook.
long sentence.
It's all going round and round, that sentence.
Yeah, and that sentence is long, and it has 1/5 of the sentence referring to India and advancing India towards self-government, which is almost exactly the same language as Montagu had used in 1917. That is not independence. So they intended to have British control in a system where, you could argue that Canada is a completely independent country today. Maybe, but they acknowledge the king, King Charles, is their king. Australia's king is King Charles, and so is New Zealand's. Now, but even they have gone much further than they were, I'd say, until about 1970. So they have become far more independent now than they were then. But in what Britain intended for India was less than what Australia, Canada, and New Zealand even have today. So, so they would have their control, now all of that was changed by the fact that India's military revolted against the British. And that is exactly what Bose said he would do. He said that I have 60,000 men and women. They have 1.5 to 2 million people under arms. There's no way that we are going to defeat them in war. What we will do is we will convince that army that it is an army of occupation. And once they are convinced that they are an army of occupation, they will rebel. And once they mutiny, that will end the empire. And so it did.
That's a very good note and a very persuasive note on which to end the first part of our series with P.K. Basu. And I might even add, just to support his thesis, that the independence of India was indeed declared by Subhash Chandra Bose at the Cathay Theatre in Singapore, long before we became independent on the 15th of August, 1947. So thank you,
So
PK,
that
for
date
joining
was
us.
21st of October, 1943.
21st of October.
And 8 years later, by the way, the Bharatiya Jansangh was established on the 21st of October, 1951.
Of course, but that was Vijayadashmi.
Very clearly.
And there was a Yes, I mean, the tithis may not coincide, but there was certainly a reflection, and that historical moment was commemorated. So thank you, PK. We will join you again in this fascinating conversation on your book, India Reborn. Congratulations once again on this book, and look forward to joining you again. And viewers, if you like what you just heard, please share and subscribe and spread the word. We do want to create content which is intellectually engaging, but also really deeply meaningful. So thank you, PK, once again, and namaste.
Thanks
All
a
of
lot. Thank you.